So for the next 3 classes before spring break, we are going to be looking at a particular answer to this general question. Does the mind have parts? And so I'm kind of tired of listening to myself lecture. So I'm going to try to make this class a little more interactive, which means I'm going to be asking a lot of more general questions. They will not be things that are directly tied to the readings. They will rather be sort of open-ended things without right answers, just to make this a little more discussion-based and a little bit less you stare at a screen while I ramble on. So that means that if nobody's answering questions, we could have some awkward pauses today, during which I just sit here and drink water, but they're not going to be especially complicated questions. So to begin, and we're going to be basically the next 3 classes are just going to be looking at a particular answer to the question, does the mind have parts? So to begin, I want to just focus on, what does this question even mean? What does it mean to ask, does the mind have parts? And so to begin, I do want to say one thing, which is the question, does the mind have parts, is not the same as the question, do thoughts have parts? So we've been looking at things tied to this question for the last 3-4 classes. In the last 4 classes, we've been answering, or we've been assuming that there's a particular answer to this question. What's the answer we've been assuming to the question, do thoughts have parts? What has our answer been in the background? Yes, they have. And specifically, what have we been calling these parts? I'll give you a clue. It's what we've looked at for the last 4 classes. 5 classes? 4 classes before last class. It's the C word, and not the one that the other way C word. Marie?
Concepts.
Yes, concepts. Sorry, I forgot to look down. So concepts, we've been assuming, yes, they have parts and that they're concepts. So when you're asking, do thoughts have parts, what you're asking is like the thing that you think, the thing that is the object of your thinking, does that thing have parts? Does the mind have parts is a different question. So what is the question, does the mind have parts? Intuitively, and this is going to be the first open-ended question, if somebody's asking, does the mind have parts, what is somebody trying to get at? What is somebody asking? And again, there's not really a wrong answer here, so feel free to jump in. If you were to hear this question asked by your professor right now, what do you think they're getting at? What is the core of the question, does the mind have parts? So what is the relationship between a thought and the mind?
The mind produces the thought?
Yeah, so the mind is the thing that produces the thought, or the thing that does the thinking. So if we think of the mind as the thing that does the thinking, and we define it in this sort of functionalist definition, where the mind is just whatever it is that does what we call thinking, what would it mean for the mind to have parts? What would it be for this thing, the thing that does the thinking, to have parts?
For example, one part is responsible for one type of thoughts and the other.
Yeah, exactly. Alan, you wanted to say something?
He got it. He nailed it.
Yeah. So here would be the idea. The idea would be that the mind, because the mind is a functional thing, we don't think of it as one big object that does all the thinking. Rather, we think of it as divided into parts, each of which is responsible for some type of thinking. So the idea would be that, yeah, Raven says the brain controls different types of thought, like left brain versus right brain activity. Scott says the mind is split in a way where the mind has different functions. So there's the conscious, unconscious, subconscious sort of thinking. And this is exactly what it would mean for the mind to have parts. You can think of it as similar to like in a car, your car, the act of driving, like your car has parts, and it's not just that you can chop it up. It's rather that the parts of a car or the parts of a bicycle each have their own job that together work together to make the thing that we call driving. You know, you've got the thing that turns the wheels, and the bike, you've got the things that control it. So in the same way, the question with the mind is, does the mind have parts? Can we think of the mind instead of just the thing, the mind? Can we instead think of it as something that can be broken down instead of one one whole system. Instead, think of it as multiple subsystems, and each of those subsystems would be part of the thing we call thought. So you'd have one part of the brain that has to do with, or one part of the mind that has to do with maybe creative thought, a different part of the mind that is in charge of calculations, another part of the mind that's in charge of feelings. Now, another question then, well, then we have, so this is the background of what we're talking about with does the mind have parts? Now, here's a separate question, and this is one that's really open-ended, and I kind of just want to make everyone think critically on the question, is why should we care? Why should we care about the answer, does the mind have parts? And this is like, so another way of asking this is, what are some of the implications if it does have parts? And what are some of the implications if it doesn't? And this is very, very open-ended. So, opening it up for for answers. What are some of the implications that you can think of? This is just an exercise in creativity. Why should we care if the mind has parts?
Maybe we should care because if we know that it has parts, we can kind of analyze human behavior. So it can answer for things like if you're trying to fix an electoral problem and you want voter turnout, you want to think like, how do people think in terms of voting?
Yeah, and so that's a really, really great case of when you have a problem that you're trying to solve, the way in which whether there are parts or not are going to affect it. So for instance, if the mind is just one big thing where every aspect of thinking is just one general thing thought, then it's going to be much harder to find useful strategies for solving particular problems. So if it turns out that the reason that people are biased in certain ways in electoral systems is having to do with like the way in which bias affects your mind, then knowing whether there's a specific part you can control versus an entire, controlling thought is going to be much more difficult than if you say that this particular problem that is arising is a result of this particular way of thinking that is controlled by this particular part of the mind. Another one, Jazib says, because it makes it easier to study how the mind works and how our beliefs and understanding work. So the first one is Marie's point. I can't think what would be a good way. If parts operate differently, we need different strategies for influencing them. Another issue, the one that Jazib just brought up, is if there are parts, studying the mind gets easier. Now, why is this the case? What is it that makes studying the mind easier if there are parts? Well, if there are parts to something, then you can focus on one part at a time and not have to worry about every single bit of it. So for instance, if you're trying to understand how a bike works, you're not going to try to learn bikes in like the mechanics of bikes all at once. You're instead going to have to learn like, how does the gear system work? And you're just going to focus there. And you can come up with a very good understanding of that part. So if it's able to be broken into parts, you can study the mind in much more easily bite-sized pieces. If there's a universal thing, the mind, that's all thought, then we somehow need to account for every element of our experience. So, logical reasoning, racism, why you cry during sad movies, why you get irrationally angry when you stub your toe. All of that has to be explained in the terms of the same type of thing thinking. If we can say that there's like an emotional part that deals with emotion and it operates in a separate way from a different part, then it becomes a lot more possible to explain how these sorts of things work. All right, that's another great one. I'm just going to erase these up here and just put more interesting things. So we've got, I'm going to change to black because it's easier to see. Lino's question is, so I'm going to put up 3. Where is the self? So here's another question, which is, we like to think of ourselves as individual people, and we care about ourselves and our well-being. If the mind is some unified thing that is just like equivalent to a soul, then it's easy to say where the self is. But things get a little more complicated when you start to think, like, if my mind has parts, do I want to say that all of these parts count as me? Or am I just, is the thing myself, the I that I talk about, the thing that has feelings, the person I care about, does that correspond to every element of me, or is this just some part of it? Another one, Raven asks, it helps with things like mental illness to see how parts are affected and how it contributes to the illness. So yeah, this is the one that pops up in my mind first always, is things like mental illness. You're trying to treat mental illness, and whether there are parts to the mind and how those parts work and what they're like is greatly going to affect how you treat mental illness. So I remember in the first class that we had, or I guess the second class after the syllabus, people were asking a little bit about Freud, of whether we'd be talking about Freud. And I said he'd come up at some point, inevitably. So let me just, like, to give an example of this one, let's talk about Freud for a second. So Freud believed that the mind could be divided essentially into 3 parts, 3 functional parts. Anyone who's taken a psych class or have a passing interest in this know what they were called?
The id, ego, and superego.
Yep, id, ego, and super ego. Now, how exactly to interpret these, it's very easy to oversimplify them, but generally speaking, how do they interact? Does anyone know? Just like, and caricatured version is fine here. We don't have to get Freud totally right. Just generally speaking, how should we think of these things? Well, what is the id? How many people have heard of the id?
Is that like your like subconscious primal desire?
Exactly, subconscious, primal. And according to Freud, this is what most of the mind was. So these are like your deep-seated desires of, like, you know, the things that are at your core, which are almost embarrassing, but they're the things that are like driving your force. So in the id includes all the things that are most closely associated with Freud. So, like, you know, the desire of all boys to have sex with their mother, according to Freud, was a thing that was the case, and it was stored deep down in our subconscious in the id. Then on the other side, we've got this thing, the superego. Does anyone know what the superego is, or what it's supposed to do according to Freud?
It's your morality.
Yeah, it's like the very highest level thing. It's the thing which is basically the part of your mind that tells you, no, don't do that, or that's wrong, or this is immoral. So this is the morality and like politeness bit. So this is the part of your mind that, like, you're aware of. So when you think like having sex with my mother is bad, that's your superego talking. The id is underneath it all, and it doesn't ever, sometimes it'll bubble up to the conscious level, but most of the time it's like your deep, dark desires underneath the surface. And the superego is what's on top, and the superego is telling you, no, don't act on those desires. Don't do that. And the ego is really the I in the middle that's kind of responsible for figuring these 2 things out. It's responsible for both fulfilling or making sure that these primal desires don't overwhelm you, while also respecting the superego's views. And if you start acting too much on your id, it goes one way, and you start having problems because you're doing all sorts of bad stuff. And if you've got the superego too powerful, then you end up like stilted and very unhappy. And so this way of dividing it up, now these days, how this cross cuts the parts we'll be talking about, and most people think that this is an oversimplification, but this was one of the first times in which someone said the mind has parts. And this way of thinking about the parts had major implications for how you dealt with mental illness. So before Freud, people thought of mental illness in many cases as just like something that was completely unfixable, because the only way to fix the mind is to talk to it. And these people, you couldn't talk to them. And what Freud was one of the first to say was, well, what if we say there's another part of the mind that operates underneath the surface? And sometimes that's what's responsible for mental illness. So he did a lot of work with hysteria, and basically, or cases of like PTSD, and before it was called PTSD, but these were cases in which people had extreme reactions. And people were just like, well, this is a hopeless case. We can't do anything with this. And he started thinking, well, if we think of these sorts of things as arising not from these higher levels, but just from a disturbed id with too much energy in it, then maybe we can deal with these things by working with the id in terms it understands. So for Freud, the way you dealt with these things was just to become aware of them, interact with them, to basically you had to let the steam off in certain senses. So if you let these unconscious desires just underneath and out of control, you would lose control, you would have extreme reactions. Instead, if you could just almost like a boiling pot, let the air out, then the id would no longer be as out of control and you no longer have this excess energy. So this was a way in which he approached dealing with mental illness. And these days, even though there are not many people who subscribe to a lot of Freud stuff in therapy, people are still approaching things, oftentimes thinking about it in terms of parts. People, instead of, just saying like, well, the way to deal with your problems is to approach them on the surface level, it's instead like, let's go back to your childhood. Why is it the case that you respond in this way? Is there a younger part of your mind that's somehow stored in there that's more primal, that gets an extreme fight-flight reaction? So yeah, mental illness is another one. Anything else that people want to bring up for reasons why we should care whether there are parts to the mind? I mean, there's just a simple fact of every psychologist has to care, because if you care about psychology and you want to know how the mind works, you need to know, are there parts? So you can then ask what the parts are. Lino just said implications for AI. That was literally the one I just thought of as well. So yeah, AI, if we're trying to design computer systems, knowing what the parts of the human mind are like and how those parts operate will be useful for understanding how to program computers to operate both like a human mind, and also maybe to find out ways that human minds don't work. So like if we want an AI that isn't racist, maybe we look at how the part of the mind that ties in with unconscious beliefs and unconscious sorts of thought processes, how that fits in. Any others that people can think of? Because this is really like, are there parts to the mind is really a core idea that really ties in with a lot of the other areas in psychology. And it's really a background question, a lot of things. Another one I'll bring up is it has so empiricism versus rationalism stuff we talked about before. What were empiricism and rationalism or nativism? Anyone remember what this debate is?
Empiricism is believing that which we can.
I think that the debate is where we eventually like get from our experience.
Yeah.
So for empiricism, it's like from our like basic experience. From rationalism, I actually don't remember, so it's better for you to explain.
So yeah, so anyone else want to take a stab? Alan?
Rationalism is basically just like what you can come up with pure thought.
Yeah, rationalism is basically this idea that there are parts of thought that you don't need to point back to experience. It's pure thought. Empiricism is the idea that everything ultimately bottoms out in experience, and everything you think, every concept you have, every rule you have for learning has to come through experience. And so questions of whether or not the mind is like a blank slate with nothing on it, or whether the mind is something that has concepts and things built into it, is closely, innate knowledge versus experiential knowledge. And the reason why this ties in is if you're going to say the mind has parts, it's going to be very closely tied in with where did these parts come from. And if you're an empiricist who thinks that everything comes from experience, you're going to be of the belief that at the beginning, when you're a child, there are no parts to the mind. Because if it's like the point of a blank slate is that it's totally blank. There's no organization to it. So the questions of if we find that even from childhood, there seem to be parts to the mind, then that suggests that some sort of nativism or rationalism about the mind is correct. And then whether rationalism or nativism is correct is going to tie in with other questions, things like the nature-nurture debate. Is it ever going to be possible to, like, are certain, like, bad habits or things we dislike, are they programmed into us from before we're born, almost like instincts? And so that's going to have implications for things. All right, so everyone on board just generally with what would it mean for the mind to have parts, and why should we care about these parts? Does this all sound good? All right. Let me erase here. So we've already talked just now about Freud and one of the ways of thinking about the mental parts. But we're now going to look at a different one. And this is going to, for better or worse, be Fodor again, which, as an incidental thing, the reason I have you all reading so much Fodor is, like, as a sociological fact, he is like a giant within this field. And there's a strange thing where just about every major debate, because cognitive science really only took off in like the 70s. So in the past 50 years, Fodor was basically involved in most of the major debates within cognitive science. And also, he's somebody who very often like makes grand, big statements that kind of put in context the entire thing that's up for debate. So he's one of these people where, in a lot of ways, interacting with Fodor is a good way of getting the general gist of an entire topic. Just because he was such a giant in the field. And he was also one of the philosophers who does a better job of engaging with the empirical sciences. A lot of time people just rely on like what are their gut intuitions. Fodor and then a few others really engage much more closely with the actual science and with the psychology behind it. So that's why I have you reading him. It's not that I personally find his writing style sometimes delightful, sometimes infuriating, but it's not just that I also don't think he's right about everything. I just think he's a useful way of getting into this stuff. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to spend the rest of class basically painting Fodor's picture of the parts to the mind. And then next time, we are going to look at his reason for thinking that the mind is divided in this way. Now, to be clear, he is not entirely leaving open that these are the only types of parts. He also leaves open how these types of parts interact with things like unconscious or conscious thought. So we're going to come back later about how these things fit together. But the basic idea is going to be what we lay out in this class. And then the next two classes, we'll talk a little bit more about this. And it's really, this is a useful way of or one of the useful distinctions to understand in cognitive science, because it touches on a lot of different areas. So to get into this, the best way of doing it is to go back to our fun friend, the computer metaphor. So we said mind, marker's dying, mind like computer. And what did we say a few classes ago that means exactly? What does it mean to say the mind is like a computer? So if here's the mind, and we say it's like a computer, what does that entail? What does it mean to say the mind's like a computer?
It processes information and gives output.
Yeah, it processes information, and the way it processes information is in terms of strings of symbols and symbol manipulation. And it's got a memory where these things are stored and drawn from. So the core idea of the computer metaphor is that what thought looks like would be something like this. Now, granted, it but basically there are mental symbols, and just like a computer is able to do everything it does simply in terms of a software program, the mind operates in the same way. It's just a matter of well-formed thought formulas that get modified. So to have a new thought, or to originally have thought this and then change it, is to substitute like this symbol. You have a rule that says anytime you get a circle, then create a, it's just, you can give a mechanical explanation of it. So that was the core idea of the computer metaphor. And then there's also with a metaphor going to be things like memory. And just like with a computer, you've got, it can be divided into short-term and long-term memory. So these are the basic core ideas of the computer metaphor that we've been talking about. And we've been looking at what are these things, the concepts like. Now, I said when I was initially talking about the computer metaphor, though, there's also things on either end of the computer. So in the case of a computer, what is it? If a computer is a system that's enclosed and just moves symbols, but what gives a computer power and usefulness? Why do we have computers in the world? If all they did was move symbols around, we really wouldn't care. But what is it about this? Think about the things that a computer does in your life.
I mean, I don't know if this applies to the mind, but a computer basically does stuff that we can do except much quicker.
And so it does the things we do much quicker. So it does thinking like things. But why is it? And in the same way with human beings, what is it about these symbols that makes them useful and that makes these transformations important to you? When your computer moves a bunch of symbols around, why do you generally care about it? So right now, each and every one of our computers is moving a lot of symbols around. We're all working through computers. Why is it useful to us that our computers are doing this right now?
As Alan just said, because it's fast.
It's fast, but it's not just that it's doing it fast. It's you're 100% correct. It's all doing these things quickly and fast. But what is it? Like, I could, with this computer, like you can turn a computer on, fly it over the desert, drop it into the desert, and it could do all the same calculations it's doing
because
right
we
now.
can control it.
We control it, or just importantly, it interacts with the world. So in the case of a computer, we push the buttons, and then the computer produces things on a screen. Or it produces beeps, or it produces music, or in this case, it's producing something on a screen that corresponds to me. So I say things, they enter the computer through the camera converts it into a digital collection of information that my computer processes, sends out across a bunch of internet cables. It goes through the air to my modem, which then takes it, sends it out to you. You all get it. Your computer processes that information and shows you something on the screen. So it's because the computer hooks up to the world and can take inputs from the world and produce outputs into the world that make it so valuable. And this is the first way. So in the same way, then, the mind is also going to do this. The mind, if it's like a computer, is going to take inputs and is going to give outputs. Now, in the case of the computer is, in some sense, this part here, what inputs it gets is itself, and this is where the computer metaphor isn't perfect. A computer, what determines what inputs it gets? Where did that design come from? Or what is the purpose behind it? When a certain thing pops up on the screen, why is it that thing that popped up on the screen? Who controls it at the end of the day? Or who wrote the program that leads to it controlling this thing?
People?
Yeah, people. So here's a major difference is a computer system is like a mind in that it's information processing, but there's also another sort of information processing system, a human being, who inputs this into the mind. So that's one major difference here. But the idea that there is an input system is something that carries on with humans and computers. Now, so if there's no human being pressing inputs that go into the mind, in the case of the human mind, where does the input come from? What is it? So let's go with this one. Oh, the dinosaur. So where is Conrad?
I was gonna say sensory, but my mic cut off.
No. Well, your mic may have cut off, but it's still the correct answer. So sensory. Senses. So what is it that somehow, why is it that our mind is able to get inputs about the world? Well, it's got these lovely things, the senses. So when you see a coffee mug in front of you, or you have a thought about a coffee mug, the question is, how did that get in there? Well, somehow it came through the senses. And now, let me erase this and really just focus on the mental part. So, there's what puts the input into the mind, and also importantly, what makes your thoughts and concepts in the mind about the world in some sense is their causal or connected interactions with it. So in your mind, you have a thought, say, this is going to be your thought of your house. I'm actually going to, no, that's a terrible house, but I'm actually going to draw it this time. No, it's now going to be a cube because I can't draw a house. So you have a thought of a cube. And say it's a cube. It's not a good cube, but it's a cube. So this cube is now in your head. You have a concept of a cube, or you're thinking about a cube. And the question is, how did this get in there? And so what makes this thought about a cube, and how did it get in there? Well, it's got something to do with your mind. And specifically, the parts of your mind connected to your senses. So here's an eye. So generally speaking, I'm going to change it to something I can actually hold up here. So, all right. So you've got a concept of this expo marker in your head. The question is, how did that get in there? And the answer is something to do with your senses. Now, why is it that this got into your head? Why do you have this concept of the expo marker? And like this expo marker, you can have thoughts about this particular marker right now. How come you're able to have these thoughts about this marker? Describe to me what it is.
To have an experience of interaction with this marker because of you.
Yeah, so you had a visual experience of the marker. And so here is the marker. There's a thing out in the world, namely this marker, that goes in through your eyes somehow, and then somehow something about that becomes the marker. But here's the complicated bit, is how does this work? And this is why, this is the idea of explaining how a marker out in the world is able to become a concept of a marker in your head. The need to explain this process is where Fodor's going to argue the mind's parts come from. And he's going to say, for us to get from experiences of the world to having thoughts or things out in the world to become thoughts of things out in the world or concepts of things out in the world, we need specialized systems that operate largely independently from other parts of the mind, whose sole job it is to turn external world things into thoughts about external world things. Now, why is this the case? And for this, we're going to talk some quick perception and sensation versus perception. And this is going to be something that is rather useful. So in everyday life, people very often talk about your senses or sensation, and perception is interchangeable, or to perceive something. But in cognitive science, they're used somewhat differently. And the reason why is to explain how a thought of a marker gets into your head. You need to talk about these two things differently. So let's actually talk about the science behind how on earth you end up having, and it's made even more complicated by the fact there's a computer here and you're looking through a Zoom. But let's pretend we were in person right now. How do you turn an actual marker out into the world into a thought about a marker? Does anyone know what is involved in this? Let's start with step one. Oh, Conrad.
I was gonna say shape.
So shape is somehow involved in this. Now, what do you mean by shape in this particular context?
You have to observe the object, that it has a depth, it has some sort of height, width, volume,
So
surface area.
So this has a lot of properties. This has things like height. I'm just going to put etc. That's going to include color, depth. And somehow what's out there in the world as this marker ends up represented in your head. And the thing in your head, when you have a thought about this marker, you recognize that it has height, size, color, etc. But here's the crazy thing. How did that happen? Is this marker, is your concept of a marker a marker? Your concept of a marker is what? It's a concept. What is a marker? A marker is not a concept, and a concept is not a marker. You can have a concept of a marker, but you can't, if you were to put a marker into your head, you'd have a lot of physical damage done to you. So somehow we have to get all this information into the head. Now, here's the issue of it. Does anyone know anything about the human eye? And this is actually going to become important. Let's talk about the eye. So let me draw up a little picture. This is basically just like sensation and science 101. So here's what the eye looks like. It's got this thing, which is the lovely black pupil, which is, you know, what we all see. And then around that is the nice little colored bit, whose name I can never remember. And that little colored bit is a muscle that controls the pupil. And basically what it is, well, what enters the eye? What gets in there?
Reflection of light.
It's light that goes in. So the marker never goes through your eye. Instead, some light goes in here. Light, light, light. Now it goes through here like this, and then it hits a little lens which focuses it, and then projects an image onto the back of the eye. And this back here is the retina. That's, no, is that the retina? I can never remember what it is. Yes. So back here at the back of the eye is basically a 2D thing. So basically what it is when light enters is basically shadow puppets. What your eye is seeing, you don't see a whole hand. The information that hits the back of the eye is just shadow puppets. It's a two-dimensional shape. Now, because of this, so if you actually were like chop open an eye, what it would look like to see something is similar to a painting, where it's just a bunch of dots of light on the back of your retina, or the back of the eye, which is the retina. So it's light back there. So it's not a 3D image, because the retina is not built 3D. It's the same thing with a smell. Like your grandma's cookies aren't a thing that enter your head. Does anyone know what actually enters your, where the sense of smell comes from, what the core is?
Aromatic compounds.
Yeah, aromatic compounds, which is a really, really fancy way of saying tiny little parts of whatever it is you're smelling. So like if you smell cookies, it's because there's microscopic cookie parts floating in the air. If you smell poop, it's because there's microscopic poop parts that have entered your nose. So all the senses, what they do is they take some physical thing, and then somehow that physical thing gets turned into an experience. And the major issue is that light out in the world is, we said that the mind operates in symbols. It moves things around, and those symbols are about things in the world. However, the things out in the world exist in a way that the smell of rain is back here. Is that true, Alan? That's really cool. I've always wondered what the smell of rain was.
Yeah,
Interesting.
That's like in the grass, and then it gets thrown up in the air because of the water hitting it.
Huh. That is a great fun fact. I'm planning on using that. I'm not sure to who, but I'm planning on subjecting all my friends to this fact for the rest of the week. As you can tell, me and my friends have really lively lives. So the idea here is that somehow our mind gets a three-dimensional thing, but really all you're getting is light reflected off a three-dimensional object, entering the eyeball. and then getting turned into a two-dimensional image. Then somehow what has to happen is this 2D image somehow has to get converted into a mental symbol that your mind is able to add into thoughts. So the idea here is that your mind is somehow turning a physical thing out in the world, which causes certain physical properties to enter, and then those baseline physical properties that are recorded then get converted back into a representation of that thing. So the way to think about it is you have a thought of a 3D marker, and there is a 3D marker. But to go from the 3D marker to the thought, you have to go from 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions into mental representations of 3 dimensions. So this is like a much more complicated process. We think of the eye as like the window onto the world, but really it's a complex process whereby 3-dimensional space is turned into a 2-dimensional scene and then turned back into a 3-dimensional space. So this is where the sensation versus perception comes in. When the things that actually hit your eye, the sensation is whatever it is that actually hits your sensory organs. So this is the actual pressure on your hand when you press something. This is the light and the light recording on the back of your eye. This is those little tiny particles hitting your nose. But we don't experience those things. Like, I can tell you as much as I want. Like, I have to teach you that the retina at the back of the eye is collecting a 2D array of light. What do you experience? What is it that you see when I do this? Well, back to Conrad's point. What were some of the things you saw, Conrad? What was your experience of this like?
My microphone was muted the whole time. That's great.
No worries.
I see the depth of the marker, like the shape and silhouette of it.
Yeah, so you experience, and automatically in your experience is of a 3D thing. We know that this is a 3D thing. Marie, do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is like, so if we're like relating our eye to being like the window of the world, isn't that indicative too of like some problematic aspects? Because like I know our periphery is black and white, so that kind of like screws up the whole sensations part. So does that have an impact for representations?
So yes, so here's the idea. Is another thing is, as a matter of fact, there are certain aspects of our sensation that do not line up with the representation. So actually, like, look straight ahead right now, everybody, and look in the corner of your vision. Your experience feels like it's colored, correct? Does this seem correct? Like it doesn't feel black and white. But as a matter of fact, if I were to, and I've done this before, if you want to do it with people, what you do is you take like a pack of colored pencils and hold them behind someone's head and just slowly move it into their peripheral vision. And so you might feel like it's colorful, but it won't, you will see the mark or the colored pencil, the marker, whatever, in peripheral vision before you're able, like you will know there's a marker there long before you're able to tell that this thing is colored or what color it is. It'll look gray until it gets to about here. So even though somehow you experience color on the sides, like, or your conscious experience is of things in color, in truth, somehow that is being produced despite the fact that the information entering those parts of the eye are not in color, which is another way in which these come apart, where somehow our experience of the things in the periphery are as if they were in colored, and our mental symbols are conscious experience. So here's another way in which our sensation of the external world is actually coming apart from our experience. So somehow we get from black and white, two-dimensional things hitting the sides of our eye to an experience of 3D complicated things of the sort that Conrad was talking about. And the idea is that to understand how the mind works, what we need to understand is somehow these sensations get turned into a perception, where a perception is not just the actual physical things hitting the body, but an experience of something. So if we were actually to talk about like what enters your eyeball, there's nothing intrinsically about the marker that enters the eyeball. Rather, it's light that enters the eyeball. However, you have an experience of a marker. You have an experience of a table when you put your hands on it. You get an experience of a smell. So what this means is somehow we need to explain how it is that the external world gets turned into concepts of a representational perceptual sort. So you can basically think of the way this goes as it's world is out here. These are things like actual markers, rocks. These things cause things to enter our minds and hit our sensation. Somehow then, this sensation gets turned into perception. And this perception is what we experience. We don't just experience, like none of us feels light hitting the eye. Instead, we experience or see a marker. We see each other. We see a human face. Then it is this thing that then goes into, we can then combine and form thoughts about it. We have these markers, rocks, etc. And now, the idea of how the mind is organized, how Fodor's going to set it up, is he's going to argue that the mind shouldn't be thought of as basically just a mind that interacts with the world. You should instead think of it something more like this. You've got a central mind, which is associated, amongst other things, with conscious thought and reasoning. This is what we've been talking about for the past few times. This is where our concepts are. This is where our beliefs are. However, then out in the world, we have things like rocks, etc. So I'm just going to draw a rock. And this rock hits what he calls the transducer, or basically the sensory. And then what he wants to argue is there's a special sublevel. This is the thing. This is the level, he calls it input, that's job is to take the things that hit the sensory organs and turn them back into conscious, like the sorts of things that are available for conscious thought. So he's going to say that these things here are a necessary part of the mind to understand how it is that the mind's organized. So it's not just that things in the world enter the mind. It's that things in the world enter the specialized perceptual system. And then that perceptual system turns these sensory inputs into a format that thought can deal with. And the reason why he says this and what some of the implications for this are that this system is going to basically be an enclosed system that you cannot affect. Your beliefs cannot affect this internal smaller system. The only thing that can affect it is what's working on the inside. And this is going to have implications where if it turned out like what is inside these input systems becomes valuable. So for instance, if you see certain types of properties, you can't not see them. So if we said that like anger is something that a human being represents, that if you see somebody as angry, you cannot stop seeing them as angry, even if you know they're not angry. It will not be possible if it's inside here. And so he's going to argue, and what we're going to be talking about more next time, is he says there's one central processing unit, which he's going to basically call the central processor. And then there's going to be 6 of these external things, one for each of the senses and one for language processing. And so what we're going to do next time is talk about why should we think this? Why should we think that the mind's set up like this? And then what are some of the payoffs or what are some of the implications for this, both for psychology and how it works, and also for like the way the mind works more generally, and things like, well, if the mind is organized like this, what are the implications for practical life? What are the implications for things like teaching people new things? What are the implications for everyday sorts of concerns? So we're going to talk much more next time, but does everyone understand this general picture? And also, if you ever just want your mind to hurt, like read up on how the mind turns random pieces of particles or light or sensory whatever, or hearing is itself crazy because we hear sounds, but really what is a sound actually?
Vibration.
Yeah,
Vibrations.
it's air vibrations. So there is, like, if we didn't have ears, there wouldn't be anything other than air vibration. What we call a sound is some, like, who the hell knows what. And so it actually, like that good old question, like, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, is there a sound? Well, it's not clear how to even approach that question because it's not clear what we mean by sound here. So, like, would there be a boom? No, the only thing that hears a boom is something with an ear. Would there still be air vibrations? Yes. But really, our experience has to do with a lot of little hairs moving around inside your ears and like all sorts of other things, which also inevitably, if you listen to music too loud, is why you end up going deaf, because you can physically damage these little hairs that vibrate in accordance with air and somehow get turned into sound. So the idea that we somehow have these specialized input systems whose job it is to turn these things like light and sound or air vibrations into experiences of 3D objects and sounds and events and things. Yeah, the hairs in your ears do not grow back. They're not like head hairs. They're little like hair cells. So if you've lost your, like, if you're anything like, does anyone other than me have tinnitus? First off, do you know what tinnitus is?
I have tinnitus.
Okay, I'm not alone. Good. For those of you, the rest of you, does everyone know what tinnitus is?
Is it like
Tinnitus?
a ringing thing?
Yeah. If I'm ever in a quiet room, I have constant ringing in my ears. I hear a high-pitched ringing 24/7, 365. I can't sleep in a silent room. It drives me nuts. I need a fan going. It's not so bad that it affects me when I'm talking or anything, but like anytime there's no noise, all I hear is just like constantly. It's very annoying and it's never going to stop for the rest of my life. So that's fun. If you ever get tinnitus, they're starting to discover things, but there's nothing you can really do about it right now. And this is another one of these ways where really what has happened is that the ear hairs are damaged in such a way that they're like constantly giving off signals. Yep. No, sometimes it is super hearing. Sometimes you can hear things that other people do not, but that high-pitched buzzing sound or the high-pitched sound, basically human beings were not designed to listen to lots of large, loud sounds. Because think about it, where did we evolve? How did we evolve? What were our ancestors like? What was the loudest sound before the Industrial Revolution? Like, well, thunder. And how often would that come along? So like this idea of constant noise hitting your ears is not something human beings were designed for, which is why our hearing systems break down and why everyone goes deaf. Like if you put a like ancient person into New York City, they would just be overwhelmed by the amount of sound. Yep. It basically, whenever you hear ringing after something, that is the ears, them being damaged, and it does not take much to damage them. So yeah, just be careful of your ears and accept that you're probably already a little bit deaf because you've lived in New York City. You can't stop it. All right, enough about earring, which is like hearing, only earrings. Any last questions on this stuff? All right, so in that case, next time, we're just going to be talking about how Fodor defines these systems and what some of the implications are. Conrad, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I just said no.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, everybody, have a good rest of your Monday. As I said, or Wednesday, or whatever the hell day it is. As I said at the start of class, if anyone has any questions about papers or anything, feel free to email me. If you've got any concerns, anything. I will give a brief overview now of what we'll be talking about next time, but it's going to be very brief and I won't talk about everything because the next couple classes are just going to be talking about this stuff. And it's basically just listing properties. For those who are interested though, the main thing Fodor says and why we should think there's these input systems is basically we're going to spend a lot of next class talking about illusions because visual illusions, auditory illusions, they're all really fun and cool, and they make a pretty cool point, which is that if the mind was one big like collection of information where all the parts work together, then everything should in some sense be correctable. So when you, like, imagine you were born into a highly religious family, and you were born going to church 7 days a week, and then for some reason your views change and you are now an atheist. In this sort of case, you had one belief, you change it. Same thing where if you were born into an atheist house and now you're very religious. That suggests that in light of new information, we change our beliefs. However, so is it true that color is just an illusion created by our brain? It depends what you mean by color. And this is itself going to be complicated. It seems like the thing that we typically call blue as a property of things out in the world that also causes us to have an experience does not correspond to anything in particular out in the world. However, the physical properties of a blue object are different from the physical properties of a red object. So in some sense, yes, it's an illusion of our mind. Like the experience of red is not something in the property. And the properties that make us experience that experience of red are very much unlike our experience of redness. And it's tough to wrap your head around or talk about, but in some sense, yes, it is kind of just an illusion. Sound is even more of an illusion though. Like that experience of sound or words does not correspond to anything other than air vibrations. Like your experience of sound is nothing like what we think of air vibrations as, and yet they are somehow the same sort of thing. So what we'll be talking about is he argues that if you actually look at conscious thought, it's correctable, you can change it. But if you look at illusions, like well, I'll save them for next time. But the basic idea is even if you know something's an illusion, you still see the illusion. You still hear the illusion, which is suggesting that whatever processing was responsible for turning this into an illusion, you're not going to be able to unsee it. And that's suggesting that whatever it is to see it in the first place is not something that's hooked up to your beliefs. It's not hooked up to your concepts. And this has implications for such things as why it is that we are able to see things so damn quickly. Why would it be the case that, you know, it doesn't take you long. If the moment I say a swear word or the moment you hear your name in a crowded room, you instantly turn. You don't have to analyze it. It somehow automatically happens. So his idea is that these input systems are very automatic. They happen almost without our conscious control. And this is suggesting there's something about these input systems that are different from the conscious thought system, which seems more in control of us. In some sense, it feels like this is more the self, and this is just the information providing to the self. Now, we'll then talk in a couple more classes about what are some of the interesting implications for this bigger picture. But this is what I wanted to start with, of just like, what is this general thing? And there's like 17 different definitions he gives for an input system, but or characteristics. We're not going to cover every one of them, but it's basically, it seems like it's a fast automatic thing that no matter even if you didn't want to see the world in 3D, you couldn't stop yourself. And this is supposed to show that you have these specialized systems that operate independently from your overall mind and are very focused on a specialized task, which suggests that this is something separate from the rest of your thinking processing system. Any questions on that? We'll talk about a lot more next time, as well as why we should care and why it's interesting. And if nothing else, I'm just going to force you all to look at illusions for a long time, which will be very fun. All right. And again, if anyone has any questions about any paper stuff or this stuff, feel free to reach out. And I'm going to stop the recording. If anyone has any questions, we can chat for a bit now.